What I want to do for the rest of the class period is go forward and talk a little bit more about how to organize our thinking about democracy and journalism, a bit more material that might seem perhaps introductory in nature, and then I want to start grabbing a hold of this concept of democracy. So, I'm going to start by suggesting that in this class, and in fact in life in general, it's always good to go forward with whatever subject you are investigating from what I'm just calling here 3 modes of inquiry: the philosophical, the historical, and the sociological. When I try to understand an idea, an institution, a profession, a practice, whenever I'm trying to get my hands around something new to me, I try to think about it in philosophical, in historical, and in sociological terms. And I'm going to suggest that that's a good way for you to approach the material that we're going to engage in this class. I think it's a good way to approach life in general. So let's talk a bit about what I mean by these 3 modes of inquiry. Obviously, they attach to certain academic disciplines. We have a philosophy department, a history department, a sociology department here. But I'm using them in perhaps a slightly different way. When I say I approach things in a philosophical manner, what I mean is that whatever we're doing, trying to understand in the world, especially in human societies, there is a way in which I think we're always searching for the truth. And maybe there is no one truth. Maybe some questions don't even lend themselves to declarations of truth. But there's still a yearning to understand the truth. And I'm using truth here in the sense of something being universally true. That the philosophical inquiry is the attempt to come to understand universal truths, even though we know that there is very little that we can say with much certainty is universally true, especially about human societies. Okay? But still, we want to explore that. So if we're going to discuss ethical questions, we know that the practice of ethics will vary considerably, but we also are always trying to, is there something that is in fact universally true in the realm of the ethical? We're always trying to work. We're going to talk a bit about democracy here. Is there something, are there some things we can say about democracy that actually do apply across time, place, and culture? I'm not saying we ever get to those universal truths. I'm not saying those universal truths necessarily exist. Right? Many of you will have different ideas about that. Some of you may come from theological systems where there is an assertion of universal truth. Some theological systems do make that claim. Others may come from theological systems that don't make that claim. Others may come from secular backgrounds where there's no attempt to make that claim. You all are coming from different places, and you'll have your own ideas about this concept of truth and whether or not there can be universal truths. But whatever we come from, it seems to me we're still always searching for that, just in case it's out there. Okay? So when I look at something like democracy, its relationship to journalism, there's always a part of me that's trying to find those things that I can say, yes, that's true. And that's true across the board. That's the philosophical for me. On the other hand, I like to study history. And the one thing that even a cursory study of history tells you is that people organize themselves in often very different ways across time, place, and culture. So in addition to searching and yearning for something that might be true universally, we recognize the specificity of human existence, how in different times, places, and cultures, the same question will be answered very differently. Sometimes, especially looking back historically, we can say that the way those questions were answered at one point in time were inadequate. Most of us, for instance, would look back at feudalism in Europe and say that was the wrong answer, right? Divine right monarchy, nobles, serfs, peasants, a rigid hierarchy, right, based on no particular justifiable condition. Yeah, feudalism. How many of you today would argue that feudalism was consistent with moral principles? No, not a lot of people stand up and argue for it. So we look back historically and we can say, okay, that was That was maybe an inadequate answer to the question of how to organize society. Fascist totalitarian states don't have a lot of backing these days either. So we look back historically, we see that people have answered these questions, for instance, about how to organize politically in different ways. Some of them we look back and see them to be failures by any criteria. Others we still wrestle with, but we recognize this diversity of human experiments, and we want to learn from that. We want to remember that the way that we do things at one particular moment, which may seem very sensible to us, may somewhere down the road look as crazy to others as feudalism looks crazy to us. Okay. So we're yearning for this universal truth. We recognize the complexity, the historical specificity, the need to always be reminded of that diversity. And finally, I think we want to think sociologically. And by that, what I mean is always keeping an eye on how power is distributed at the moment in the society in which we live. And I hammered on this last week. There is always a distribution of power in any social setting, everything from small groups of friends to large nation states. That distribution of power can be formal or informal. It can be based on consensus and cooperation or violence and domination. But there's always a distribution of power. And in sociology, at least what I take away from that discipline, is a kind of relentless focus on power and the way power operates, especially in large, complex, modern societies. There are other aspects to sociology, I know. But I'm distilling from my own experience these questions. I try to think universally about truth. I try to think historically about the very different ways people have organized themselves throughout history. And I try to always remember to keep an eye on power. 3 modes of inquiry, right, that you might want to keep in mind as we're going through. And operating at all 3 levels all the time. Right. Questions, comments about that? Does that make sense to you? If not, let me know. Okay. One more list of 3. You'll notice I love lists of 3. All right. 3 levels of inquiry. When we make an inquiry into the world, we're going to try to inquire into the nature of democracy, the nature of journalism, the connection between democracy and journalism. We're always going to be doing that at different levels. Let me talk a bit about that. We're always looking to inquire at what I'm calling the empirical level. We want to know the data. We want to know what's out there. An empirical inquiry, by that I simply mean trying to look at the world, observe, and pull out relevant data. How are things actually working on the ground? There's an empirical inquiry. We're interested in democracy. Okay? One of the things that happens in democracy, at least in the United States, is that we select leaders through elections, yes? We often want to know how many people vote in elections. That's an empirical question, yes? There's elections out there. How many people are voting? Under what conditions does voter turnout increase? Under what conditions does it decrease? Those are empirical questions. They're trying to gather data about how the world works. And as we're trying to understand that world, that's one of the levels at which we inquire. Data, however, is not enough. If all you had in front of you was raw data, what would you understand about the world? Virtually nothing. So we have to pursue the analytical. We have to take that data and analyze it, put it into some form that can help us understand how the world works. Just knowing about the world is not adequate to figuring out how the world works. That requires the process of analysis. So we go forward with empirical inquiries, but not for the sake of just knowing stuff, to aid in our analytical efforts to understand how the world works. And then finally, there is a normative level. Normative, just a term that comes out of philosophy. from the idea of setting norms. A normative statement is one that doesn't describe the world, doesn't analyze the world. It tells you how the world should be. Here's a normative statement. You all should sit there, shut up, and write down everything I say, because then you'll be smarter. That's a normative statement. It asserts that if you do that, there will be something that happens. You'll learn to your benefit. I'm not opening up a debate about whether that is appropriate or not. I'm just saying that's a kind of normative statement. Okay? So there are these, what I'm calling 3 levels of inquiry: the empirical, the analytical, the normative. And we're always going to be doing all 3 of these, often at the same time as well. I want to go a little further and emphasize that not only do we engage in all of these, but it's not a ladder where you start with the empirical, step up to the analytical, and then to the normative. It's not that simple. It's not that neat and clean. Because we're always doing all 3 of these at the same time, and they are affecting each other. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Sometimes people will say, I just want the facts. Yes? You've heard this? Don't give me any of your opinion. Don't give me any normative claims. Don't give me your analysis. Just give me the facts. There's only one problem with that. There's never just the facts. Because the facts are not like rocks sitting out there. You know, you go out, let's say you go out in the forest and there's a rock. That rock is there independent of you, correct? That rock is there independent of what you think about rocks, correct? That rock is there independent of how you think rocks came to be formed, correct? Okay. All right. The rock is a material object which has an existence outside of you. When we start thinking, it's not so simple. We say, just give us the facts, but what about the background to how those facts came to be? What about the question that led you to look for those facts and not these facts? In fact, our empirical inquiries are always shaped by previous analytical and normative claims. When you go out into the world, you don't wake up in the morning a blank slate, do you? It would be a very strange world. They make movies about scenarios, you know, people have amnesia, wake up every morning as a blank slate. Nobody actually does that. If you woke up every morning intellectually as a blank slate, where would you step? Where would you go? What would you look for? How would you know what to even look for? Right? The way we engage in that empirical inquiry, the way we go about gathering the facts, is already shaped by how we think the world works and how we think the world should work. Our analytical and normative claims are already shaping the way we go out to try and understand the world. Okay? So these 3 levels don't operate in some simplistic way where you build from the empirical to the analytical to the normative. Right? It may be fun to imagine that as you're sketching out a diagram in a textbook or something, but that's not the way the real world works. Right? You are born into a world in which, before you've even come to any conscious thoughts yourself, you're told how the world works. If you were born into the world before Galileo, you took it as a given that the Earth was at the center and the sun went around the Earth. And as you went looking for facts about the world, you would have had that in the back of your mind. You already had an analysis of how the solar system was operating. There was also a normative claim behind it. It was divinely dictated. Right? And so the way you went about looking at the world before Galileo would have been shaped by that. Your empirical inquiry would have been shaped by that. The facts that you claim were just the facts would have been shaped by that. After Galileo, it's a whole new ball game. Your empirical inquiry is going to be shaped by a different analysis with a different set of normative claims underneath it. So, it's never so, when people say, I'm just tired of all this opinion, just give me the facts. I can understand that. Sometimes one gets tired of all the blather, all the argumentative frames in which we're forced to engage. But there is nothing that simple. Let me offer one other way to say, oop, hold on. See, I told you. There. This is one way to encapsulate that idea. No knowledge is pre-theoretical. What does that mean? No knowledge is pre-theoretical. When you know things, you don't know them starting from a blank slate. You know things already in a world in which you have come to understand the world in a certain way, either because that's culturally how you were socialized to understand it, or because that's how you came to understand it personally, or more likely some combination of the two. That analysis you take into trying to understand the world is already affected by the normative claims underneath it. No knowledge is pre-theoretical. Every time you go out in the world to try and understand how the world works, you're bringing with you an existing theory about how the world works. It couldn't be otherwise. It's how the human mind works. Now, what's the point of belaboring this? Because one of the things we have to do, and I think one of the key tasks in a university education, is being able to be aware of this. That as you're engaging in inquiry, as you're trying to understand the world, you're already bringing in a picture of the world. And developing a capacity to be critically self-reflective about that picture of the world will greatly enhance your ability to clarify for yourself how that world works. That means, as Socrates said, examination of life, skepticism. Not skepticism in the cynical sense. Well, there's nothing true and nothing could ever be true and I don't believe anything. Not that kind of skepticism, but skepticism in the healthy intellectual sense. Subjecting everything to that kind of inquiry. That's what I think we need to do in this class. I think it's what we need to do in the university more generally. It's what I think we need to do in life. Okay. Now, one more thing here. And then we'll move into a more, I think, focused discussion of democracy. Normative claim. What do I mean by normative claim? Okay. A claim that asserts a norm, a way things should be. Right? Normative claims are all around us. Often they are so routine we don't even recognize them. Here's a normative claim about democracy. What do you need to have a truly democratic system? Well, in this country, it's almost taken for granted that you need free, fair, open, contested elections. In a large-scale modern nation-state, the United States has 300 million people. We don't have direct democracy where everybody gets in a room to decide things, right? You didn't even need Robert Dahl's book to remind you of that. Democracy in the United States does not work with 300 million people coming together to decide every issue. We operate through a representative system, and that means that democracy really means and requires free, fair, open, contested elections. In the United States, it's commonly assumed also that democracy requires freedom of association. You have free, fair, open, contested elections, that's great, but people also have to be able to associate, to come together in political groupings, or else you don't really have a democratic society. So it's not enough just to have elections, you have to have freedom of association. If I was in charge of a system where I allowed people to vote, but I used the police powers of the state to make sure people never came together to engage in political activity, would that feel very democratic? No, it wouldn't feel very democratic at all. So freedom of association is crucial, and freedom of expression. If you had a system of representative elections that were free, fair, open, and contested, but people were not allowed to speak because I used that police power to suppress your ability to speak in public, would that feel very democratic? No. So these aspects of democracy are taken for granted. It's a normative claim. It's saying this is what democracy should be in a large, modern, complex society. You should have free, fair, open, contested elections, has to have freedom of association, have to have freedom of expression. Okay? Now, as you read Dahl and you think about your own experience, you'll know there's a lot more people say about democracy, but those are very core aspects that we take for granted, this normative claim. All right? You move on from there and you say, okay, so democracy requires meaningful guarantees of freedom of expression, of speech and press. That if we're going to label a system democratic, our empirical inquiry and analysis has led us to this normative claim, that there have to be meaningful guarantees of freedom of expression. I highlight this because we're in the journalism school, very important. We focus a lot on this struggle to establish meaningful guarantees of freedom of expression. Moving on, in journalism we make another normative claim, that an independent journalism is crucial to check the abuse of power in institutions and among leaders, that journalism has a special role in all of this. This is a normative claim. This is not saying this is what journalism does always, or this is what the way journalism works. It's saying this is what journalism should be in a democratic society. It should be an independent force that has the power to check the abuse of power in other institutions and among leaders. Very common normative claim. These are so common that you probably don't even think much about them. They're just sort of the background assumptions, but they are normative claims. And there are other ways people might imagine a democratic society. So I'm throwing these out, and we'll go into more detail as the semester goes on about each one of these. But those are examples of normative claims. Now,